Let me turn the floor now over to Todd Harrison. What Todd's going to do is to give you examples of, in particular, where the four different teams really had a common approach to a particular problem or particular program, and maybe some outliers as well. So, Todd.
Thank you. And again, I want to thank all the teams for putting in the extra time to go through this exercise with us. And as you heard from each of the teams, we all had different approaches, different priorities, different capabilities to invest in or divest of. But what I'm going to show you as a numbers guy, I like to dig into the data and see where we made choices that were similar, because I think that's enlightening that, you know, faced with the budget constraints that we gave everyone in these two scenarios, in many situations, we all made very similar decisions. I'll also highlight a few areas where there was not a consensus, where the teams differed significantly. I think those are areas that are in need of more analysis, more investigation. And the other thing I will point out is because we did two budget scenarios at different funding levels, in some cases you will see that the teams made the same decision, whether it was the full BCA or the half BCA scenario. So that indicates decisions that are not necessarily budget driven. I'll also point out again that we took things like compensation reform, acquisition reform, and other efficiency initiatives off the table for the purpose of this exercise because those are more management decisions than strategic choices. But I think I speak for everyone up here that we all support all of those things, and we all think that they're absolutely necessary. And if those things come true, if we can get compensation reform, if we can get real acquisition reform that reduces the cost of weapon systems and modernization programs, if we can achieve some of the real common sense efficiencies and stop wasting money within the department, what that will effectively do is free up resources within DoD. So if you look at what people did in the full BCA scenario, when we freed up resources and gave them the half BCA scenario, that indicates what they would buy back. So if we did get some of these reforms, then this is going to give you an indication of where people would spend that money and what they would buy back. Now, I'm going to start by showing an overview of the rebalancing that all of the teams did. Now, while you take a look at this chart, it's color-coded. The dark bars are the full BCA scenario for each team. The lighter shaded bars are the half BCA scenario. The part on the top are the adds, the new investments they made, things that were not in the baseline. And the bottom part of each bar is what the teams cut. Now, under the full BCA scenario, we asked them to cut $330 billion over 10 years. And as you see here, every single team cut more than that. They did that because, as you see on the top, they all made new investments. They all bought things that were not in the program of record. So what this gives you is an indication of how much rebalancing all of the teams did. And in some cases, like with the CNAS team, they did the most rebalancing. Their cuts were almost identical in both scenarios. The difference was when they were given money back, they just chose to invest it more in different areas. I'll go to the next slide, and I'll start digging in deeper here, and I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm going to show you a lot of numbers. I'm going to go very fast for the sake of time, but all of these slides are going to be up on our website after this if you want to go take a look in more detail. So I'll start off looking at manned combat aircraft. And one of the similarities you see here is that all of the teams in both scenarios cut non-stealthy fighters. These are your legacy fighters, your F-16s, your F-18s, your A-10s. All of the teams cut them under both scenarios, and the cut levels were very similar in both budget scenarios. The other thing you'll see is that 3 of the 4 teams reduced the buy of stealthy fighter jets in the full BCA scenario. 2 did in the half BCA scenario. The other similarity here I saw is that 3 of the 4 teams put money into accelerating the next generation bomber, LRS-B. 1 team chose to hold off on that program and wait another fight up till the technology had matured. Going on, looking more detail in UAVs, We divided them into non-stealthy, basically the Predators, the Reapers, the Global Hawks that we have today, and future stealthy UAVs. This one surprised me that 3 of the 4 teams actually chose to increase the number of non-stealthy UAVs in the inventory. 1 team chose to cut back on them. So we see some level of consensus, but not total agreement there. But then if you look at stealthy UAVs, who did not have real agreement there, 2 of the teams wanted to invest in these newer stealthy UAVs, some carrier-based, some land-based. But we don't see complete consensus here. Looking into the ground forces, we saw some level of agreement here, not as much as the last time we did this exercise back in May. But you see that all of the teams cut the armored BCTs from the active duty Army in the full BCA scenario. 3 of the 4 teams cut them in the half BCA scenario. If you look at the infantry BCTs, we saw that the teams tended to cut them a little more in both the full and the half BCA scenarios. So some level of consensus there. And then if you look at overall active duty Army end strength, we all made reductions, and you can get an idea here of the magnitude of the different reductions, you know, somewhere around 400,000 in the active duty Army, in some cases a little lower, some cases a little more. Moving on to look at the Army Guard and Reserve Forces. Now, we did see a split here. As you saw earlier, the CSIS team cut deeper in the active duty Army. Well, they had a different approach here. They actually increased the size of the Guard and Reserve Forces substantially. The other 3 teams all tended to agree that in cutting armored BCTs as well as infantry BCTs in the Guard and Reserve component. And the CSIS team took a different approach, increasing the size of the Guard and Reserve Forces. And of course, Army Guard and Reserve in strength, the teams adjusted appropriately according to what you saw in the number of BCTs there. Now, in the Marine Corps, we actually did not see much consensus at all. The teams were all over the place doing very different things. So to me, this looks like an area that's worthy of more investigation. The teams did not necessarily agree. While I think all of the teams viewed the Marine Corps as having a similar role, being a crisis response force, there was not a lot of agreement about how to reshape or resize that force going forward. Then looking at your naval forces, we did see some consensus here, tended to cut the surface combatants. Looking at the number of carriers, this is interesting because you see identical levels of cuts in the number of carriers in both the full BCA and the half BCA. So that indicates that these decisions in each team were not necessarily budget driven, that even when money was restored, they did not use it to restore the number of carriers. We see a similar thing in the number of destroyers. All of the teams cut destroyers, and again, we see identical levels of cuts with all the teams in the full and the half BCA scenarios. The teams, 3 of the 4 teams, increased investments in subs. Again, this was insensitive to the budget level. And 3 of the 4 teams cut back on procurements of littoral combat ship. And of course, Navy in strength, the teams reduced according to the size of the cuts that they made. As you can see here. Now, this is, this is an area that was of particular interest to me as a former aerospace engineer and someone who's worked in the military space community. I'm kind of jealous of the CNAS team and their half BCA investments they made in this area. They bought a lot of new satellites, so I tend to like what they did there. But you can see that all of the teams made a net positive change in the space cyber comms portfolio. They made cuts, but they also made a lot of new investments. Now, digging a little deeper into this, where was there some agreement in the new investments that the teams made? One area we saw was in protected SATCOM. 3 of the 4 teams in the full BCA scenario and all of the teams in the half BCA scenario increased the number of protected SATCOM payloads on orbit. Another interesting area we saw here was in cyber offense, cyber defense. You know, the options that we gave the teams, given that a lot of this operates in the black world, is highly classified, the options we gave them in the game were just to add more resources, more people, and they could direct that either towards cyber offense or cyber defense. We saw 3 of the 4 teams in both scenarios chose to increase the number of personnel working in cyber offense. So we saw a little bit more of an investment in offense versus defense. Now, an area that's near and dear to many people's heart who work in the Pentagon is the future level of DoD civilian workforce. Now, we gave the teams the option to cut civilian personnel separately by service, and we saw in many, if not most cases, the teams were making cuts in civilian personnel that were in proportion roughly to the cuts in the force in each service. And so you can see here, when you sum it all up, the total number of DoD civilians in all of the teams were reduced by about 100,000 or more as a result. And this is an area, you know, that I know DoD has struggled with, and it may be difficult to do some of this, but a lot of the savings generated in this exercise came from cutting back in personnel like DoD civilians. We also gave the teams the option to cut service support contractors. Now, I'm talking here about people who provide services to DoD, not people who provide products and make weapon systems. We're talking about service contractors who do everything from answering phones to mowing lawns to systems engineering work. And all of the teams made reductions in these service support contractors. As I reminded them when we were conducting the exercises, you know, these people do something. So when you cut them, just remember you are going to be doing with less. And as you can see here, many of the teams made cuts in service support contractors that were in proportion to the cuts in the civilians and the overall size of the force. Now, looking at strategic forces, we see several areas of agreement. All 4 teams in both budget scenarios continued the funding for the B-61 life extension for the nuclear warheads. All of the teams continued funding for the mods necessary on the F-35 to make it a dual-capable aircraft so it could carry nuclear weapons as well. And we also see here that 3 of the 4 teams cut back on the number of ICBM wings in the Air Force, and 3 of the 4 teams wanted to keep all of the Ohio-class SSBNs until their full 42-year life expectancy comes around. Now, looking at missile defense funding, there's not a lot of agreement on the specifics of what to invest in or divest of, but what we saw here was a significant amount of rebalancing among the teams. 3 of the 4 teams made significant changes in the program for missile defense. 2 of the teams on the right-hand side had a high net positive, so that's a net investment in missile defense spending over the next 10 years. And readiness, the teams touched on this briefly, but this was something all of the teams ended up cutting back on, albeit reluctantly. And the cuts you see in readiness for all of the teams that occurred in the first FYDP, because that's the hardest time to achieve the savings. And this is one of the few areas where you can cut back quickly, whether it's a good thing to do or not. You can cut back on readiness quickly. And the investments you see in readiness were in the second FYDP, where teams said, hey, I had to cut back at first. I'm going to try to recover some of that. Maybe it's delayed maintenance, or maybe I've shifted to tier readiness, but I'm going to recover some of that in the second FYDP. Now, other areas of agreement across all of the teams in both scenarios. All of the teams retired active component A-10s. 3 of the 4 teams also retired them in the reserve component. All of the teams chose to retire the U-2s and restore the Global Hawk Block 30. All of the teams canceled the remainder of the JITRS AMF program. So, Senator McCain, we all agree with you on that. All of the teams chose to retire some of the F-18 C and D models in the Navy inventory. We all delayed the ground combat vehicle, and we all funded what we're calling a clean kill BRAC. And we put that option in there at the request of the teams. That is a much more narrow BRAC. It is the opposite of the 2005 BRAC. The restriction we would put in that is that you cannot close anything unless the savings from it pay for the upfront cost within the 5-year period. If the savings don't recover the upfront cost in 5-year period, it can't be in this BRAC. As a result, these would be smaller BRACs, but they would basically pay for themselves over the 5-year period by definition. And the last slide I will leave you with is a comparison of all the choices the teams made by the service budget and how these budgets would be effective, the percentage change in these budgets. Now, I will confess up front, the way we structured the exercise, we organized all these options by capability areas. We intentionally didn't organize them by service because we didn't want people to get into, the service stovepipe mindset of, well, let's just distribute these cuts equally across all the services, and that is often what happens within the Pentagon. So we did this on the back end. After everyone made all of their rebalancing decisions, I then went and calculated how much that would add or cut from each service's budget. We found something interesting here. All of the teams, without necessarily realizing it, actually increased the amount of funding going to the Air Force over the next 10-year period, again, relative to what was in PB-14. And all of the teams cut funding for the Army, if not the most, second most compared to defense-wide. So I think what this shows is that there's some consensus here that there needs to be a rebalancing, and we don't necessarily need to stick to the same service budget shares that we may have become accustomed to over the past decade or so. And with that, I want to stop and open it up. I'll turn it back over to Andrew to handle questions from the audience.